I chaired the National Early Literacy Panel, which was a federal research review panel that looked at all of the research on teaching young children reading and focused on 3, 4, and 5-year-old kids. I taught first graders, and I have worked in schools for more than 50 years and done this kind of thing for a very long time. Back in the 1990s, the U.S. Congress decided that there should be a panel appointed, not to give any kind of opinions or recommendations, but strictly to make a determination of fact as to what the research had to say. That was the National Reading Panel, and I served on that panel, and we did what we were asked to do, and that report came out and had very big impact on the field. But then after that, people were very interested in this idea of applying research. I would suggest using a practice guide as a sort of starting point. Identifying what the issues are, what some of the major things you can do to be more effective in this literacy area with kindergartners, say, and then picking a particular recommendation that you perhaps don't feel like you're doing as well as you could, or don't know enough about, or maybe aren't doing at all. And obviously, if you can, as a group, read that section and look at those examples. Some cases that might be enough for you to go back and try something in your classroom. In other cases, it might be just a jumping off point to maybe chase down some resources on that so that you can read more deeply or find other information on it. The best thing you can do is go and try some of these ideas out to see how they work, and if they're not working smoothly, bring them back to your group and share that information. I think a lot of times what will surprise somebody is they'll try something out and it'll be great. They loved it and it worked, and they'll go back to their group and there's somebody else in the group going, I don't understand how you can make that work. I think that the guides are really useful, but I think they're in some schools it's sort of we read through it, we talked about it, and we're done with it. But I think it can be much more of an agenda item that gives you a series of steps that you try to take on and that you work through. And obviously, if a person has to do that on their own, that's harder, but it's not impossible. And it can be useful to them as well. A principal can play a really important role in using these guides. They can definitely use them as a jumping off point for the professional development that they foster, or even in some cases deliver in their schools. Again, depends on what resources are available. They also can become a tool the principal, himself or herself uses to educate themselves on some of these issues. Maybe it'll give them some guidance on their walkthroughs and supervision and what to look for when they're evaluating and so on and so forth. I think these have a pretty wide set of practical uses in the development of instruction and the professional development of the education staff. We need to make sure that children early on learn letters and start to understand the phonological system of our language. And at the ages that we're talking about, initially that means just hearing the sounds, being able to hear those separable language sounds. A word like cat has 3 letters, but in terms of sounds, what's important is it has 3 phonemes. K, at. It's easy for me to do that being a reader and being highly literate and so on, but when you're 3 or 4 or 5 and you're at a stage of life where you're learning dozens of new words every single day as you develop from toddlerhood to going off to school, this great explosion of vocabulary that happens with young kids. You're not perceiving the individual sounds as much as you're focused on the words themselves. And so being able to get kids to focus on the sound separate from the meaning. The issue isn't, do you know what a cat is, but can you actually hear those separable sounds, which enables the youngster to eventually start to learn the alphabetic system of how we match letters or spellings to sounds or pronunciations. And so developing that fairly early on is a tough thing for young children, but it's something that can be a lot of fun to develop with them, but it's very, very important in terms of their literacy development. I would suggest, when I look at the research on teaching those early alphabetic or phonological skills, is the research with young kids, all of these lessons in the studies have been to individuals or small groups. They're not, oh, we gathered 20 kids on the carpet and did the activity. And I think those large group activities can be absolutely fine, but here you're trying to learn something pretty specific, and it might be, at least for some individual kids, pretty hard to learn. And so the idea of let's organize this intelligently, and like I say, when I look at the studies, they're quite consistent. They taught these things to young children, but they were typically one-on-one or one-on-3 or 4. And so that would be one piece of advice. Let's keep this small. A second piece of advice would be, let's keep this very short. We're not going to have a very long lesson of this. They might be, a very good lesson of it might be a few minutes. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm only going to do that once a day. I might pull those kids to the sound table more than once, but they're going to be brief exposures that when we work on that. We make it fun. I mean, one of the things with phonemic awareness and phonological awareness is there are a lot of songs and poems and so on that allow, banana, banana, bee, bo, banana, the name song, all that kind of thing, where you have to change out the sounds and so on. Kids love that kind of thing. It's very playful. But it does the same kind of thing that a worksheet would or whatever, and engages the kids and makes sure that they hear those sounds. The big thing is the way of responding. That in this particular case, I want to know whether these two words begin with the same sound or different sounds. Big bin. I want you to pat your tummy if it's if they're the same. I want you to do something else if they're different. Making those kinds of things very active. So yeah, you try to make it playful. You try to make it about song and language and so on. But the ultimate goal is the youngster has to be able to hear these sounds and distinguish them. I mean, when kids are first starting out, it isn't even the phonemes. It's not those individual sounds you hear within the word. It's the words themselves. Can you separate them out? So I was just in a classroom where the teacher, she had a poem that the kids had memorized, and they had all the words on the floor in order, and the kids had to go and find their place. Where does it say Mary? Where did it say lamb? That kind of thing, and the kids would have to find their place. So you'd get those separations between the words. What about syllables? Timothy Shanahan. So, oh, Jay, that's a clapping activity. It could be a jumping activity. It could be, you do a do-si-do with the person next to you. You can change these things any way you want to. But what I need the kids doing those things around is hearing those sounds and learning how to make those separations. And then as they do that, obviously we move on to finer and finer discriminations. And of course, their concentration gets longer as the year goes on, and so you can spend more and more time, and you need less and less of breaking it up the way that I was suggesting. The kinds of strategies that we're talking about are really pretty simple. For example, one of the things that we know makes both reading and listening comprehension more effective is if you stop along the way and kind of sum up for yourself what you've heard so far or what you've read so far. And so I'm reading through a book, and I've read a couple of pages. Might be a good idea to, gee, what's the author told me so far? Did I understand it? If I didn't understand it, maybe I should go back and do a little rereading. But if you do that, of course, you spend a little bit more time thinking about whatever the message was. and you certainly come to terms with whether you're not understanding it. And if you keep doing that through a reading, you increase your comprehension. So teaching youngsters to do something like that is pretty helpful. Asking yourself questions, summarizing, trying to visualize what you're reading. Noticing when you're not understanding what you're reading and doing something about that. Those are the kinds of things that we're talking about by strategies. They're these intentional actions that you can take just to make sure that you're understanding and that you remember the information so you can talk about it and use it. Think of a young child who's listening to stories being read to him by his kindergarten teacher. And the teacher wants him to do something like retell the story later. How do you remember that? How do you hold all those facts? Well, if you have an organizational structure, if you either can tell what it was in the original story or you can impose your own on it, you're more likely to remember it. And so with that young child, starting to teach them that stories have certain kinds of structural components to them. There's always going to be a setting there of some kind. That is, the author's going to tell you when this happened, where this happened, that kind of information. They're going to place it in time and space. You can remember that. There's usually going to be a main character. You can remember who that character is. That character is usually going to face some kind of a problem. Gee, I know what problem that Goldilocks faced or that the three bears faced. I can figure that out. And so if you know those kinds of parts, you can start to summarize and remember and retell and use the information to do what you want to do with it.